Hey there poetry pals, welcome back to another video. This week we are talking all about Valley Fest, which was my first festival in 2 years. I hosted the talk stage, and so in this video we're going to discuss how I got the gig, how to host a stage, what makes a good talk, and then a little bit about festivals in a pandemic as well. But before we go any further, please make sure you like, comment on this video, subscribe to my channel. All of this interaction really helps small creators like me get found, so make sure you do all of that. And while we're on the subject, please make sure you follow me on social media. I am at Josie Alford Poet on all the things. So let me tell you a little bit about Valley Fest to start. Valley Fest is a relatively quite small festival. It's held at Chew Valley Lake, right by Chew Valley Lake. It sort of sells itself on being a sort of family friendly festival with an especial focus on food as well as music and other things as well. So actually for my first festival back, especially after a pandemic where maybe we're all feeling a little bit anxious, Valley Fest was perfect because it wasn't too big, but it still had all of the classic ingredients of what makes a good festival. And let me tell you, I had loads of fun. I recently watched the This Is Pop documentary, and they have an episode about festivals, and one of the things that people talked about a lot was this sort of opportunity to step out of your everyday life and just be together with people. And I don't want to make this sound like really hippy dippy, but there is something I find inherently spiritual about being in a space with lots of people who are there for one purpose. And I think I find this the most apparent when you are watching a headliner or any musician and everyone is singing along. I just see that as a moment of being able to connect, and I think that is something that as human beings we inherently need to be able to connect with other people. So yeah, being back at a festival was really special to me. Over the whole weekend I kept having to pinch myself to be like, oh my god, I'm back in at a festival, drinking warm beer out of a can and watching music, and it was a really beautiful experience. So personally, I found being at a festival really good. I'm going to cover the sort of like COVID side of things later on in the video, but I just wanted to give you a bit of an idea about my emotions being back at a festival. So the next thing I want to talk about is how I got the gig. So as I said, I was asked to do this by a friend of mine, Beth, to host. And you might think, oh well, that's just nepotism, isn't it? You know, Beth just hired you because she's your friend, and she wanted to give opportunities to her friend. And whilst maybe a smidgen of that is true, I think there is still something that you can learn from my experience, which is I've been hosting events for years. I've been hosting events before I got into poetry. The first events that I ever used to host were pub quizzes, and I've been doing that since I was 18 years old, which means I've been doing it for 10 years. I naturally feel very comfortable on a microphone in front of a room full of strangers, and I am good at hosting events and creating a welcoming space. We're going to talk a little bit about like how to do that later, and in fact I might even do another video more in depth about how to be a good host. If that's something you would like, make sure you comment, like I want to see how to be a good host. But so I got into the poetry scene in around, I think the first time I performed in Bristol in front of other people was 2014, but I really started getting into the Bristol poetry scene in 2015. And not long after that I started hosting a poetry event because they were looking for a host that also had social media experience, and I was like, it's me. So I hosted the Hammer and Tongue poetry slams in Bristol for like 2 years, and one of the things is that I eventually got known for being quite a good host more than I did a poet, which is something that I am still trying to get the balance right of to this day. But the fact is I got myself a reputation of being a good host, and then at all these poetry events where I was turning up just to watch people, I used it as an opportunity to make friends and to, you might call it, networking, but I think that's a bit too cynical. I just realised that poetry and the spoken word scene was something that I wanted to be a part of, and in order to do that you need to make friends, so you're not just turning up by yourself. And so I met people. Beth is one of the warmest and friendliest people ever. I'm good at making friends with strangers, but you wouldn't need to be to make friends with Beth. She's so wonderful. So yeah, it was a sort of combination of networking and being good at hosting led me to be able to be asked to host it. I had been to Valley Fest before just as a poet, and I kept calling it last year, but it was actually 2019. I did a set as a poet. You can actually see my Spice World the Poem video, which is on this channel. You can see that, and that was Valley Fest in 2019. And so that Valley Fest, I did one set, and then I was also involved in Tea Time Tales, which is just a super cute storytelling thing for kids, where all the poets have to bring their favourite children's story along. And I really enjoyed that process. I very much enjoyed going to Valley Fest and being crew, and I also was just one of the people who'd be like, hey Beth, do you need help packing up? So I was particularly useful. And so when Beth got more responsibilities at Valley Fest, which included programming a whole other stage, she asked me to host it because, in her words, she felt confident that I would be reliable enough to run the stage by myself. So Beth was the one who programmed all of the speakers, who booked them all, who did all of the email admin. In my opinion, the worst part of event organising. And I got to do the fun bit, which was rock up, introduce some really cool people and watch some really interesting talks. So yeah, that's how I ended up with the gig. One of my friends asked me, has this opportunity led to other opportunities? And admittedly, the festival literally ended on Monday. And so far, no. However, I have met a lot of very interesting people throughout this process and sort of networked and made friends, and so I'm going to be using the opportunity to expand my other freelance aspects like social media consultancy and stuff like that. If you're watching this and you saw me hosting and you think, oh, I'm hosting an event, I would love to have someone come in and host it for me, then by all means get in touch. It's something that I do incredibly well. Also, I write and host pub quizzes and I'm fantastic at it. So if you are in Bristol and the surrounding areas, or basically the whole of the UK if you cover travel, book me. I can host. I'm also a poet. You can book me to do poetry as well, but yeah. So this next section, I'm going to talk a little bit about how to host. And specifically, Beth used the words how to host / create a welcoming, inclusive and inspiring event space. As Beth said to me a few times, she was like, oh, well, the reason the stage was so successful was because of your hosting. You created such a warm and wonderful atmosphere. I would argue that that was just part of the reason. I think that one of the reasons the tent was so busy when we were open was because Beth had done a fantastic job of booking interesting talks. So it was, people were turning up early to the talks, ready to sit down. Like, people were coming in being like, is this where we're talking about the healing weeds talk? Or is this the forestry gardening bit? Or is this where Chrissy Wellington is going to speak. So I do think it was a solid combination of booking really interesting talks, which is totally down to Beth. I had nothing to do with it. And then there is a small aspect of my hosting abilities. And then there's also the aspect of the captive audience of Valley Fest attendees were naturally predisposed to come to talks like that. So, yes, enough of me being humble. Let me talk about why I'm such a great host. I think for me, especially when it comes to talks, I hadn't actually hosted any talks or Q&As before. So I drew on hosts that I had particularly enjoyed, and I especially used this in the context of festivals. I do think that your hosting style changes depending on where you are hosting. So for example, I've been to a lot of talks at literary festivals. I'm sure I've mentioned on here before that I'm the social media manager for Lyra, which is Bristol Poetry Festival, and we have lots of talks there, and they're a bit more of a formal context, whereas when I've been to talks at Glastonbury, for example, you're still at a festival, everyone is still you know, going on the compost loos and getting a little bit drunk and covered in glitter, so you can be a little less formal. So I consciously made an effort not to be overly formal. I also came prepared, like I printed off everyone's bios and stuff like that, and I read through their bios. If they had social media in the week leading up to the festival, I followed people on social media, did a quick Goog about them, but I didn't want to over prepare, so I also made sure that I was paying attention to their talks, especially because these talks involved me hosting a Q&A afterwards, and I didn't want to get on stage and no one have any questions and it be really awkward. So I watched the talks so that I could come up with questions as well, in case people were too afraid to be the first question. And that was actually a very good shout. What I did find is even the talks that had the most enthusiastic Q&As often needed a little kick. So I would start with a question and then open it up to the audience, and people were far more likely to ask the questions that they wanted. I think, you know, having your authentic reactions and letting yourself be engaged with the content is very important. On the other side of that coin, the important thing about talks is to not make it all about yourself as well. So if you are going to be really invested and like get on the mic and be really friendly, you want to make it very clear to yourself and therefore your audience that the stars of this are your speakers. It's not about you, it's about the speakers. So one thing that I tried to focus on was being madly engaged with their content and being very excited about it. So that was really useful as well. And then I guess the final thing I'm going to talk about here is keeping to time. So whenever anyone arrived, I double checked, like all of this was emailed to them ahead of time, but when they arrived I'd be like, okay, so here's how it's going to go. You're going to do a 20-minute talk-ish, I'll be flexible, and then we're going to have like a 20-minute Q&A. We need to finish by 1:45 so that I have time to sanitize the mics and do all of that in time for the next speaker. In order to make the stage a friendly and welcoming space, you want to make sure that you're starting on time for people, that people have enough time to prepare and all of that. So if you let one person overrun, it can affect everything else. So being fairly organised is important as well. So those are my tips on hosting. If you want, I can definitely make a more in-depth video about how to host events. I can go into like more specific techniques and whatever. Just for this one, I was talking in the context of Valley Fest. But if you want me to do something more in-depth, please comment down below. I want a video about how to host X event, and you could ask about poetry events or poetry slams, pub quizzes, that sort of thing. So the next bit I want to talk about is what makes a good talk. As I said, this isn't something that I've necessarily hosted before, but having hosted 13 talks last weekend, I have learnt some tips. So that if you have a special interest and you have been asked to do a talk on it and you had no idea what to do, I think this bit will be particularly useful for you. I think one of the key things you can do if you've been asked to speak at something is to stick to time. The chances are they'll have given you the length of how long they want to speak. If the organiser of the event who is booking you hasn't, please clarify. I think it's particularly important to like sort of know going in, because otherwise it can lead to a lot of awkwardness on the day, especially if you are someone who isn't comfortable public speaking or improvising in front of people. Then knowing as much information about what is expected of you ahead of time is really useful, because all of the things that you can nail down means that you are better prepared, which means, you know, less uncertainty. So a couple of people really overran on their talks and sort of like they realised that they got a little bit flustered, and that was that. So I think that clarify how long you're speaking for and only plan to speak for that long. And if you've never done this before, it can be quite challenging to know how long a talk lasts, like how many words does a talk last. And so my thing is definitely to like under plan. People definitely get up on stage and waffle a lot more than they think they do. And then my other piece of advice for keeping to time is to practice it. I know, sounds weird, that this advice is everywhere and you'd be surprised how many people don't do it, but practice your talk. Practice it on your cat, practice it on your friends, that sort of thing. I do it all of the time. The amount of times that I've done presentations for work or whatever, do it on my friends, do it on my husband, that sort of thing. My next tip is to if you can do it without writing everything down word for word, then do it. I think that you should, if you're worried about learning everything off by heart, then start with writing everything down by hand. And then I would come in with just the key points. So like bullet points written down of, well, first I'm going to talk about how I got into this area. Then I'm going to talk about my achievements in this area. Then I've got that witty anecdote. Then I'm going to give my advice. And then I'm going to go switch to the Q&A. That's actually an incredible structure for a talk, if I don't say so myself. So I would say like have a rough bullet point plan and then you can sort of talk around it. I think that that helps you to connect with the audience rather than you being sat up on the stage and just looking down and stuff like that. So I think keeping it as flexible as possible. And then, yeah, I think that's sort of my rough idea of what makes a good talk, is to know how long you've got to speak for and don't be reading it all off a page. Unless If you're super duper nervous and you need it all written down, then that's absolutely fine, please do that. But what I would do is maybe highlight the key points of each paragraph so that if you want to, you can be looking up at people. And then if you've lost your place, you can look back down, see the highlighted points and being like, oh, well, I've already spoken about that, so I can go to my next highlighted point. Those are my rough tips on how to put together a good talk. Again, if you want me to go into more detail on this and actually do some research and pull together a really good video on it, then please comment below. I want a video on how to be a good speaker or put together a good talk or whatever. So the final section of this video, what I want to talk about is the pandemic and how it sort of worked at the festival, and I think someone asked me how it had changed the atmosphere. So I think before we go any further, it is worth saying that like at a festival, I was never the sort of person to get in a crowd anyway. Even before the pandemic, I just get anxious in tight crowds and large crowds. What that means is at any festival, I'm never going to be the person at the front listening to the music. So that's one thing. So actually, largely, my festival experience was very similar to other festival experiences, other than the fact that when I was in the tent but not on the stage, I wore a mask. So basically, as a member of staff at the festival, as crew, and as a host, I was asked to be wearing a mask in my tent because I was hosting a tent stage. I was wearing a mask. The public didn't have to, but it is also worth saying that this tent was also half open. It was very well ventilated. The other key difference was that there were so many hand sanitizing stations around, a lot more than at any other festival I'd been to. There was never a time where I didn't have access to hand sanitizer straight away, so that was very comforting. On just a slightly smaller scale, within the tent, between each speaker, I sanitised the microphones, and we also had these microphone covers, which were like foam covers for the microphones that were just sort of like hygiene covers that we replaced after each speaker as well. This was something that I found particularly useful because during the festival I had a cold sore, and I really didn't want to give my cold sore to any of the speakers, so if any of the speakers ended up using the microphone that I'd been using, we were able to change the guard over. Oh wait, one more thing. No one was allowed in the festival without a negative at-home test, a lateral flow test. So I was actually on my way to the festival on the Friday afternoon and I'd forgotten to take my test, so I had to drive home, take my test and then go in. So that was also really good. I know that there are going to be people watching this who are like, there is no way I feel comfortable being at a festival right now. And to you guys, I want to say that's absolutely fine. I just wanted to show that there are some festivals who are taking it very seriously. And I think Valley Fest is one of the good ones. I felt safe the entire time, and I also felt respected when I had things that I didn't want to do because I didn't feel comfortable doing them. I think that the festival organisers, as well as like the people I was socialising with at the festival, were very respectful of all of that. And I think that's all we can ask really going forward as we sort of like build out of this pandemic, is like, you want to keep wearing masks, keep wearing masks. You don't feel comfortable going to a club with your friends, then that's absolutely fine. I don't feel comfortable doing that either. Like, let's continue to do the socially distanced walks and hang out outside and do all of that, because yeah, we're all in this together, so let's just respect people's boundaries. So that's it for this week's video on my first festival back after the pandemic. I hope you found it useful. If you want me to go into depth on any more of these points that I covered here, anything about like how to get gigs, how to network, how to host, what makes a good talk, all of that, let me know in the comments below. I would love to hear from you. Please make sure you like this video and subscribe. As I said before, it really helps small channels like me get found. And follow me on social media. I am at Josie Alford Poet on all the things. If you liked this video and you want to show your appreciation, you can buy me a coffee. The link for that is in the description below. And if you like overall what my channel's doing, you can join me on Patreon. Depending on what level you're on, you will get access to badges, exclusive Patreon content, writing workshops, one-to-one feedback on your poems. And so yeah, please go and check that out. Link is in the description. Yeah. So that's it for this week. I'll see you all next week. Bye.